right, Shaka. That was a great conversation with Dan. So much of what he's working on and what he's been able to do with the Emerging School Models Conference. If we can put the S in the right place, that'll be great. Emerging School Models Conference is really interesting. It's necessary, it's important, and they're doing good work, and they're tackling something that is relevant. Was there anything in particular that stuck out to you?
There's a lot that stuck out to me. I liked when he's talking about having different outcomes and sort of matching outcomes based on, he said, the typology of the school.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It made me think some about different schools have different missions, and as well they should, because students are different and have different needs.
Right.
So if a school has a different mission, it stands to reason that it's going to, or it ought to be evaluated a little bit differently. Now, maybe there are some things that are common, right? I can think back to some conversations we've had about some common content. We want kids to read. We want them to read, period.
Absolutely.
But some of those outcomes, whether it's STEM or classical education or Montessori or experiential learning, whatever, some of those can be different.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was an interesting point. I have another idea that I want to share. We'll see if I can connect the dots, but because you mentioned, it seems like we might be measuring or comparing apples and oranges. Mm-hmm. And maybe because I was hungry, I started thinking about apples. But I started thinking about when I was a kid, there was one type of apple. It was a red delicious apple, and it's an example of wishful marketing, because red delicious apples are not delicious. You can tell we're not being sponsored by the red delicious apple lobby, but they're terrible. They're dark red, they're waxy, the consistency is not good. Right. Mm-hmm. Now everybody knows that Honeycrisp apples are the best.
Yep.
Okay, Honeycrisp literally did not exist when I was a school-age kid. Somebody had to say, hey, you know what? I think we can make apples better if we made them, say, a little bit, maybe the consistency is more like a pear. Maybe we do these other things, right? And they're mixing different fruits together. Then they got to plant the seeds, grow the trees. The trees have to mature, bear the fruit. And then they say, oh, you know what? Turns out this worked. Now let's mass produce them.
Right.
So then you're 30 years down the road. I think about this emerging school models sector in a similar way. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do we find kind of the Honeycrisp among these emerging schools, these new models? But we don't have time to wait 30 years.
Right. We can't miss those kids.
We can't miss those kids, right? We can't wait until those kids are approaching middle age before we say, hey, let's sort of scale that up and grow it. Also, how are we iterating in real time? So I'm going to wrestle with that, but really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I love that analogy. It makes me think of the conversation that we had with Mike McShane and this idea of fit.
Yeah.
Because and focusing on fit, and Dan spoke about this as well. But to just continue on with your analogy and the apples right away, some people don't like red apples. Some people really liked the red apples.
Yeah. Some
people were in desperate need for a different apple to suit their taste buds better.
Yep.
And no matter, as far as schooling goes, if a model that's prescribed to you doesn't work, as a child, you deserve, or as a student, you deserve some modification so that the model allows you to be who you're supposed to be the person that you're contributing to society. And in order for those models to be created and designed to serve the students, they also need to be, we know they're going to have to be modified to some extent. We know they're going to have to evolve. And to shorten that feedback loop so that every student is learning in an environment that's suitable for them and that works for them. And we're able to continue to, turn those over and take feedback and make them better as quickly as possible. That's the process by which we're going to end up finding success as a country and as an education system.
Yeah. And the way he talks about it, you can tell it's just a really nuanced process.
Right.
By which we find out what are these things that are working across this range of models and methods. And unfortunately, nuance doesn't always work well in the legislation and public policy sector,
Unfortunately.
right? I mean, because you write policy and you're writing it most often for the masses, right?
Right.
You're writing it for the 80% of the kids who we know in this moment attend a conventional public school. And we're not thinking about all this nuance, and it's really hard to write that in. So this is a practical challenge.
I was going to say, unless you write in availability for smaller subsectors
Yeah,
to make their own
that's fair.
decisions. Because, yeah, I mean, we see it all the time. You can't apply. There is no one size fits all.
Right.
There is no prescription that is going to solve for every illness out there.
Right.
And so how is it that we create a system by which we're able to specifically address communities and families and students' needs while also not overruling anybody else's
Yep.
needs and wants?
Yeah.
And
one of the things that he also mentioned that resonated with me, or with my experience, I should say, is when he talked about this survey that he did, and academic quality was like number 4, number 5.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
When he surveyed parents, and I think parents in Oklahoma,
Right.
what's important to you, what are the factors, the most important factor
Right.
in selecting a school, and safety was at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, it was a little bit depressing, but when I was a charter school administrator, that was my experience too. We would ask parents, or I would give tours of our school to prospective families. And of course, the things that I'm excited about, I'm telling them about the professional development that we're doing for our teachers. I'm telling them about all the summer kind of work, and showing them our learning lab where the kids are doing things with,
Right.
with technology in a
Right.
way that's really personalized. Those were not the questions that parents were asking about most often, right? They were never saying, "Hey, can I see your scope and sequence
Right.
for the 3rd grade math curriculum?"
Yeah.
And I get that that's kind of inside baseball sort of phrase, but they weren't asking about that. If a family had a child who's formerly at a school that was unsafe,
Yeah.
where legitimately they didn't know what condition their student was going to come home in,
That's their number one.
that's their
priority.
number one priority.
Yeah, of course.
And I found it to be a little bit demoralizing as a school leader, because I didn't get into education just so that I could have a space where kids were safe but still couldn't read.
Yeah.
But I understand how, if your child's in an unsafe environment, man,
course.
that's priority number 1.
There's got to be a way to be able to do both. The other thing that he mentioned during his discussion on that survey was this idea of parents' enthusiasm and hope for their students learning self-discipline and hard work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was fascinating,
That's
because
super interesting.
we've spoken about this before. I'm not at the moment remembering which episode it was. This idea of students, I think it was Dr. Ashley Berner, being able to learn in a classroom is one thing, but being able to create and develop the skill set that allows them to learn when they're not explicitly being taught by a teacher at the front of the room and sitting in a desk, like
Right.
being able to develop the
Sort of self-direction a little bit.
self-direction. And you have to have discipline and able to be able to do that. But what I think is interesting, I find those qualities to be totally necessary, but I think it's interesting that has become such a priority that it takes over, or it was ranked higher than academic performance. So parents on some level are recognizing that their child not only needs to be able to read, write, and add and subtract, but they need to be able to develop the skill set that will allow them to stay focused, to stay committed, to work hard when they're outside of the classroom.
Yeah.
And so what are the factors in the world right now, or what are the specific situations that kids are finding themselves in, or parents are finding themselves in, where they're saying, more than whether or not my child is a stellar mathematician, I need them to be able to be taught how to strategize in the world of self-discipline and focus and hard work.
Boy, we could do, I think, a whole episode highlighting some of the themes that came out in Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation, because I think there's some parallels there
What's for
because
him?
it makes me think uh, how interesting that lots of parents really care about, at least in his survey, that parents really care about their students having some, self-direction, self-determination, these later life outcomes, but meanwhile are creating an environment for their children that's like without harm, without
Yes.
trial and the ability to be tested. So it's almost, I wonder a little bit if there's this tension, right, where parents are
Oh,
like
absolutely.
kind of want to outsource some of that um,
Yeah.
risk
Fascinating.
taking
Hmm.
to the schools because at home they're not able to. Okay, there's my pop psychology moment for the day.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. I'd be curious for the parents listening. What does that look like? To what extent is that strategizing and learning going on in your home? And what adverse situations and discomforts are your child facing there and at school, and how are they navigating them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I want to ask you about one more thing, on our breakdown, and that is, uh, Dan was talking about how his perception of the homeschooling community
Hmm.
has changed over time.
Hmm.
Did that resonate, or I don't know if you had,
That
if
was
you had
interesting.
notions similar to his or what?
That was really interesting. I wondered. So when I was growing up, I was not familiar. I was not terribly familiar with lots of students being homeschooled, but I understood that that was an option
Yeah.
available. That could have perhaps been my location of upbringing. And then as I went through college and grad school, I again continued to be familiar with it because we studied examples from it. All of his the idea of his research debunking his biases, that was familiar because I think
Mm,
in the same way I had formed biases through my experience, through
mhm.
my research, and now really understanding the benefits of unique school models and all sorts of different ways of educating a student and educating a child. I think it just goes back to what Mike McShane said. It's all about fit.
Mhm.
For some people, they're going to have experiences where homeschooling does not serve them and does a disservice to them, and then they're out in the world trying to right the wrongs
Yeah.
that being in that situation sort of put them in.
Yeah. We
Others the
really
opposite.
we really saw that, or at least in my family, during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I've got three girls, and um, we just saw that the way in which they responded to, say, virtual learning or not was different, right? It differed as between them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one just frankly, we really did consider, oh, maybe she could homeschool because like she would
That
knock out
worked
the
for
work.
her.
Yeah, didn't really care to be on the to be doing it remotely, but was fine to just do the work and do it frankly by like 10 o'clock in the morning and just want it to be done. Another one of my daughters, I think, just really didn't care for it and does much better in an environment with more classmates and
Yeah,
teachers. And yeah,
that would fit me.
neither one is right or wrong. It's a fit thing, and I
It's a
think
fit thing.
that does take some recalibration and getting out of our own headspace and our own biases to think, oh, okay, we got to think about even different fits for different children in the same household.
Right. This fit conversation continues to come up. I think it's so important. And I'm as I we're sitting here discussing, I'm curious, what are the implications not from providing different ways of instructing. What are the implications that don't allow people to consider fit as a paramount justification for a different type of
You mean like
for engaging in a different school?
why aren't more people thinking about fit?
Yeah, why and why are they not giving it the credit that it deserves? They're saying this has good test scores, this does not have good test scores. This has, good extracurricular opportunities, this does not. And if it falls in the it does category, then that school should be recognized as a quote unquote school. And if it doesn't, that school should not be. But if a school model is going to fit for a unique portion of students or a
Mm-hmm.
niche group of students,
Mm-hmm.
is that not enough to credi- to give it credibility?
Right. Right.
And then maybe that is currently happening, and I'm just not familiar with that way of thinking, or I'm not surrounded by it enough.
No, I think it's a great question. And it seems like historically, like maybe there was a space, say, in single gender schools,
Okay.
right? You used to have, thinking about higher ed, you used to have uh, single gender, well, certainly you used to have single gender colleges and universities, but then because you had had the Ivies, you had a whole group of schools that was just for women, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about like Vassar back in the day, and
Mm-hmm.
Bryn Mawr, and Smith,
Yep.
right? And then in some ways that was trying to get at fit a little bit. I mean, it was trying to
Absolutely.
provide similar academic opportunities, but you don't. For a long time, we didn't see it really proliferate.
Well, I wonder at what point those options became standard,
Yeah.
accepted,
Yeah.
validated, and considered as part of the norm.
Yeah.
Which just makes me wonder at what point some of these unique, upcoming, emerging school models will be considered just your everyday potential opportunity for a child to attend.
Right. Right. Well, I think that's a good place to end this conversation. I'm curious to know from folks listening and watching, how they think about fit.
Yeah.
Maybe, right? Like how important do you think fit is? How much credibility do you give a school?
Yeah.
Just based on the fact that it is executing on its unique mission at a high level.
Yeah, right. To serve its unique population.
That's right. Okay. Well,
Cool.
always good to chat.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Shaka.